Hello, and welcome to Club 40 Audio's Literary Corner. Today we'll be reading an excerpt from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. I'd like first to read a small excerpt from a book entitled Stand Up, Mr. Dickens, presented by Edward Blesson, with illustrations by Jill Bennett. To my knowledge, this book is either out of print or very difficult to come by, and no audio version exists, so I hope that they won't mind me reading one page from this book. Dickens lived 10 times as fast as most of us will ever manage. In the 7 years between 1836, when he was at work on the Pickwick Papers, and 1843, he'd edited 2 different magazines, one monthly and one weekly, written Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, produced 3 more novels, one of them with a scene so sad that it made readers weep from one end of the country to the other, including the Prime Minister, written hundreds of often very long and very funny letters, visited America, and he'd written a book about that. He'd also begun another novel. Now he was very well off, and for various reasons he still wanted to make a little extra money. What about a book specially written to be read and sold at Christmas? He had, as he put it, a little scheme for that. And out of this little scheme and 6 weeks of writing grew one of the most famous of all books. He called it A Christmas Carol. In a letter, he told a friend that he'd been so closely occupied by my little carol that I never left home before the owls went out. And when the owls did emerge for their nightly hunt, Dickens too would emerge from his house and set out on his great walk through the streets of London, thinking of the next steps in the story. Reading A Christmas Carol, always including the ghostly passage which follows, with which he chilled the blood of thousands of listeners both in Britain and America, gave him special pleasure. He would invite his audience to imagine they were seated around a Christmas fire. They were to laugh and cry as they wished. That would be no disturbance to him, but a delight. He needed his audience. When Queen Victoria said she would like to hear him read from A Christmas Carol, meaning she would like him to come to the palace and read it to her alone, he respectfully suggested that she might find it better to listen to him whilst seated amongst others. In these readings he impersonated 23 different characters. Every one of them, they said, perfectly different from each other. A Christmas Carol is the story of Ebeneezer Scrooge, a miserly man, squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, and covetous. It opens in his office on Christmas Eve. It is ice cold there, for he is too mean to have anything but a very small fire. His clerk's fire is even smaller. Grudgingly, he agrees that the clerk should have Christmas Day free to spend with his family. His nephew appears to wish him a happy Christmas. "Bah!" says Scrooge. "Humbug!" 2 men arrive and ask him to make a small donation to provide comforts for the poor. "Are there no prisons?" growls Scrooge, refusing. Then he sets off for home. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern and went home to bed. He lived in a gloomy suite of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying that it might have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and had forgotten the way out again. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for no one lived in it but Scrooge, all of the other rooms being let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then, let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face! It was not in shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by a breath of hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid color, made it horrible, As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say he was not startled would be untrue, but he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, and turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified by the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the locker on. So he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above, and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below, appeared to have a separate peal and echo of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked up the long hall up the stairs, slowly, too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, but I mean to say you might have gotten a hearse up this staircase, and done it easily. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought that he saw a hearse going on before him in the gloom. A half-dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, caring not a bottom for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was all right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin at the ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guard, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down beside the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the slightest sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, paved with stones all around, with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. Yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came to swallow up the whole. If each smooth tile had been blank at first, with a power to shape some picture on its surface from the fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of Marley's head on every one. "Humbug," said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. He threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now long forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment, and with strange dread, that as he looked, he saw this bell began to swing. It swung so softly at the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted for half a minute, or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below. Then, coming up the stairs. Then, coming straight towards his door. "It's a humbug still!" said Scrooge. "I won't believe it!" His color changed, though, when without a pause, it came through the heavy door, and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" and fell again. The same face. The very same. Marley in his pigtail and usual waistcoat, tights and boots, tassels on the latter bristling, like his pigtail, and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long, and wound around him like a tail. It was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him, looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on the coat behind. Yet, though he looked at the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded handkerchief bound around its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before, he was still incredulous, and fought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say, "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Well, do it then." The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your own senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be a bit of undigested beef, a blot of mustard, or a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention, trying to keep down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed him in the very marrow of his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed eyes, in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was very clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair, skirts, and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapor from an oven. "Do you see this toothpick?" said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You're not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug! Humbug, I tell you, humbug!" At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. Ah! But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage from around its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees, his hands clasped before his face. "Mercy! Mercy! Dreadful apparition! Why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth? And why did they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad.
among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Oh, woe is me! And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth, and turned to happiness.
The spectre again raised up a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "Ah!" "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me, why?"
"I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link, and yard by yard. Is its pattern strange to you?"
Scrooge trembled more and more.
"Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was as full, as heavy, and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain."
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable. "Jacob," he said imploringly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, please tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob."
"I have none to give," the ghost replied, "nor can I tell you what I would. A very, very little more is permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. And weary journeys lie before me."
"You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed.
"Slow,"
the spirit repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge. "And traveling all that time?"
"The whole time," the ghost said. "No rest. No peace. Incessant torture of remorse."
"You travel fast?" said Scrooge.
"On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost.
"You might have gotten over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge.
The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, "Ah!" and clenched its chain hideously in the silence of the night. "Oh, captive bound and double-ironed," cried the phantom, "not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for the vast means of its usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life opportunities misused. And yet, such was I. Oh, such was I!"
"But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself.
"Business!" cried the ghost, wringing his hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business."
It held up its chain at arm's length, as if it were the cause of all of its unveiling grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again.
"At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through the crowds of my fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never once raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light might have conducted me?"
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
"Hear me!" cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone."
"I will," said Scrooge. "But don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray."
"How it is that I appear before you in shape you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day."
It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
I am here tonight to warn you, pursued the ghost, that you have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebeneezer.
You always were a good friend to me, said Scrooge. Thank ye.
You will be haunted, resumed the ghost, by 3 spirits.
Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? He demanded in a faltering voice.
It is.
I think I'd rather not, said Scrooge.
Without their visits, said the ghost, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first ghost tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over with, Jacob? Hinted Scrooge.
Expect the second the next night, at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more. And look, that you may remember for your own sake, and remember what has passed between us.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table, and bound it around its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound the teeth made as the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound around and over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him. At every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned to Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up a hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge, and floated out upon the bleak night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither, restless in haste, moaning as they went. Every one of them wore a chain like Marley's ghost. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat, with a monstrous iron safe attached to his ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below on the doorstep. The misery with all of them was, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters, and had lost that power forever. When these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window, and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable, and, being, from the emotion he had undergone, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. Thank you for joining us with the special reading of A Christmas Carol, particularly the scene of Marley's ghost. I'm your host, Wesley Critchfield, and I was also your reader during that section. Before we get really started into discussion on Christmas Carol, I'd like to tell you a little bit of what I'm thinking for Literary Corner. I would love to do more recent books, and maybe we can do just discussions on those. Unfortunately, with the way the copyright situation is and things like that, it would be pretty much impossible to do full dramatizations or readings like you've just heard, where we would read a significant portion of the book. But it'd be very interesting to be able to do some discussions on some of the more recent books that have come out. And I'd like to make this sort of a podcast/book club online, especially on YouTube. When you hear this, I would love to hear from you in the comments what you think of this story, what books you think we should review. Of course, this is going to be a situation where we are not necessarily all together to actually discuss the book. This first one will just be me discussing my views on A Christmas Carol, particularly this scene. But hopefully in the future we'll have more people coming in on it, and we'll discuss each of our books in depth. So why A Christmas Carol for our first book to go over and our first dramatic reading scene? Obviously, if you're listening to this at the time it's recorded, it's the holiday season, and everybody has read A Christmas Carol, and that's part of the reason why, because at Club 40 Audio, at least for my part, I don't intend to ever do an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, because everybody has done it. It's been read and reread, and every holiday there's a new version somewhere. There are plays that are performed every year. You could very easily call Christmas the season of Scrooge. So if that's the case, then why do it again? And especially when I'm not going to do a full dramatization. Well, that's actually the significant part. What I think in virtually every dramatization of A Christmas Carol that I've ever seen, they've pretty much gotten Marley wrong. Very often, Marley is either dashed through very quickly, or he is just pure exposition. It's just, here's the scenario, how we're gonna set up, here's how things are gonna go, this is what the rest of the story is going to be, and go. And I think that Marley is so significant. He is the linchpin of this story, and for my money, if you get Marley wrong, you've ruined your movie, you've ruined your play, whatever. Very, very few people have gotten Marley anywhere near right. Marley has been underplayed by just about everyone. The only one that I can say that really came close for me as to being done correctly is the actor who played it in George C. Scott's Christmas Carol. Frank Finlay was his name. I have listened to at least 3 different readings of A Christmas Carol, the entire books. I own a reading by Tim Curry that is available from Audible. I own a reading by Tom Baker, who's most famous for playing Doctor Who, and I own a version of the story read by Jim Dale, who you will probably know best as the reader of the Harry Potter books, or as Professor Terminus in the original Pete's Dragon with Mickey Rooney. All of them are fantastic readings. All of them I recommend. Please go do yourself a favor. Go ahead and get all 3 of these versions, or at least one of them, whoever interests you the most, and listen to them, because they give fantastic readings, and they're better readers than I am. I'll tell you straight out, I'm a terrible reader. Now, some of you may already think that from what you've heard earlier today, but as bad as it seems, I'm actually much worse. I will stutter over things, I will fumble words, sometimes I have a lot of false starts, things like that. But these guys are excellent readers. It just seemed to me that, again, they all kind of played Marley the same way. They didn't play him with the gravitas, the horror, and I don't know why, whether it was the directors or the way that the person putting the audiobook decided to do it. They didn't let them really act out the horror and the if you will, the screaming of Marley, which is part of what the horror of the story is. I don't know how you can read the lines about him setting up a whale and not do it, even if you just did it separately and then do it in the background. Unlike what I did, I just kind of read the book as it was and then inserted the screams where they are described. But if you have to do those screams, if you have to do the anger and the despair that those screams represent, there's no way you can read that the way that they do. And that was why I decided to do this production of this particular scene from A Christmas Carol. Marley is supposed to be in hell. Marley is literally surrounded by a hot wind as from an oven. In the book, we see him, his clothes are moving, his hair is moving, and the idea is that he is in the hot breath of an oven or in hell. My thought has always kind of been that Marley can see the flames, Scrooge can't. So a person who was in hell would not be, I'm here to tell you these things. They would be in torture, and Marley even says, resting, no rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse. How can you play that as basically bland and boring and not in agony? Yeah, this is how most people play Marley. Now, I understand they're trying to be spooky and they're trying to be spectral sometimes, but it doesn't work that way. And then when Scrooge makes a joke about it, when Scrooge says, there's more of gravy than of grave about you, and it makes him mad. The line that comes to mind is actually from Edgar Allan Poe. He was making a mockery of my horror. What's more, if you read what Dickens wrote, he said that the chance and hope that he was bringing for Ebeneezer was a chance and hope of his own procuring, meaning he was the one who arranged this. He was the one who arranged the spirits to be able to come to see Scrooge, for him to be having the chance of redemption. Now, for me, this has always been very significant, and a lot of times they drop this line. Even in the George C. Scott version, they changed this line to, as part of my penance, I've been sent to warn you. And I completely disagree with that choice. That's the one thing in the George C. Scott version of Marley that actually makes me upset with that version. Because, for me, this has always been linked to the story of Lazarus and the rich man in the Bible. In the story, in the Bible, I don't know if you're familiar with it, brief overview, there's a rich man and there's a poor man named Lazarus. The poor man is begging at the rich man's gates, and the rich man is dismissive of him. He will not even give him the crumbs from his table. He won't do anything to help this man. The man is injured in some way. We're not quite sure if he has leprosy or whatever. We do understand that he has sores, and then both of them die for one reason or another, which is never quite clear why they died in the story. Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom and is comforted, and the rich man goes to hell. The rich man sees Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham, and he calls to Father Abraham, and he says, please, send Lazarus to me with just a cool drink of water. And Abraham says, there's a gulf between us and we can't come. And then he says, well, if you can't come and comfort me, then please go and tell my family in the world above, in the living world, that this is what's coming for them, that this is what's going to happen. And Abraham replies, they have the prophets. They have the stories of truth. If they won't believe them, they would not believe us even if one came back from the grave. For me, this is the significance of Marley. For whatever reason, in this situation, God has allowed somebody to come back from the grave to show him what's coming, to show Scrooge, this is your fate if you do not repent. I also think that for Dickens, it was not necessarily the sin of money that was the problem. He himself, especially towards the middle and end of his life, when he wrote A Christmas Carol, he was a richer man. He had a lot of money coming in, he had a lot of fame, he got a lot of fortune. Money was not really the issue. Money was the sin of Scrooge and Marley. So for them, their hell was to be surrounded by the chains of their padlocks and money boxes, the things that they had loved and coveted so much. Now you're going to drag these things through all of eternity. It's not written in the book, but I like to think that when Marley looks at the chain, he said, I made this chain link by link and yard by yard. I like to think that when he takes the chain and he says it, he looks at the chain and it was as if this chain was the source of all of his sorrow. I like to think that in each link of that chain was written the name of someone he had wronged, the deed that he had done, the foreclosure, the whatever that he had done to these people, each sin of his. That was the significance of the chain. That was why the chain was such a burden to him, not just in the physical sense, because we are talking about spiritual things, but the memory of the sin, the memory of wrongs done, chances missed. And that to me is a big part of what I believe hell is or will be. I actually believe in a literal hell. Some people don't. But even if there is not necessarily the place of fire and brimstone that we often imagine, or that people think of it in terms of Dante. I do believe that there is a place or a way that we will be, if we have chosen not to follow the light, not to follow God. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I'm not going to be shy about that. But that those who choose not to follow God will be separated from God, separated from the light, and they will be constantly reminded, because I believe in eternity, our minds will be perfected. We will have perfect recall, total recall from birth to death of everything that we did, everything that we said, every move that we made. And we will be constantly reminded in that darkness of all the opportunities we missed to help other people, to the things we'd done wrong, to the opportunities that we shunned to accept the love of God and His gift. Another thing I'd like to compare Marley to is the father's ghost in the story of Hamlet, if you will, Hamlet Sr. Very similar tones to this, and Dickens even admits in A Christmas Carol, he says at the very beginning of the book, we must be agreed on the fact that Marley was dead, because if we didn't believe that Hamlet's father was dead at the beginning of the story, there would be nothing strange about old man walking around on the turrets at night. Hamlet was already in Dickens' head as a reference for what Marley was going to be. And it's funny to me that when people perform Hamlet, they usually get the father pretty close to right. I've seen 2 or 3 movie versions of Hamlet, and I've seen a couple of versions that were performed on stage. Most recently and wonderfully, I saw the National Theatre Live presentation of Hamlet with Benedict Cumberbatch, and there was an actor in that. Carl Johnson is the actor's name. The only thing significant from television or movies that I could tell you that he'd been in was The Illusionist with Edward Norton in 2006, and Hot Fuzz with Simon Pegg in 2007. But he is a phenomenal actor, and I also saw him in the Frankenstein that Benedict Cumberbatch did. And he absolutely nailed Hamlet's father's ghost. And if he was to play Marley the way he played the ghost of Hamlet's father, that would be the perfect version of Marley, in my opinion, if he could bring that same gravitas to it. Now, I don't claim by any means that my little reading was the penultimate reading or portrayal of Marley's ghost. I didn't have the proper accent with it, because I didn't feel that I could switch accents and all of that sort of thing, maintaining it properly. But the spirit, if you will, of the situation is what I was hoping most to portray. The sense of being in hell. There's a line that Hamlet's father's ghost says. He said, "But that I'm forbidden to speak of the details of my torment. I could a tale unfold that the slightest word would harrow up your very soul." That, to me, is what Marley means when he says, "Neither can I tell you what I would." That line is, in my opinion at least, doubling right back to Hamlet. And he knows, Dickens knows, that most of the people of his era would have been familiar with Hamlet. So when he does this story of Marley, and if you recall in the beginning of our little discussion, we read a little piece where he would perform Christmas Carol and other pieces from his repertoire. He would know that when he said, "I cannot tell you what I would," they would have gone straight to, in their minds, Hamlet's father's ghost. They would have known exactly what he was talking about. But as I was saying before, I believe that Marley has been kind of just about underplayed by pretty much everyone. The best, in my opinion, as I said, was Frank Finlay and the George C. Scott version of A Christmas Carol, which I believe was 1984. If you have not seen this version, please do yourself a favor and see it. For my money, it is the hands-down best film version of A Christmas Carol that has ever been made. There's things in that movie that are wonderful, and performances that are wonderful. My opinion of the worst Marley, the Jim Carrey Christmas Carol that Disney did a few years back. And the reason why it's the worst for my money is because they tried to make it into a comedy scene. And it was so close. It was so close to being right. You have a wonderful, fantastic actor in Gary Oldman. He is one of the greatest actors of our day, especially in film. He has played so many great roles that couldn't have been played right by anybody else. And I heard Gary Oldman is playing Marley. And I said, yes, this is going to be it. I'm finally going to see the Marley I've wanted to see on screen. And they made it into a comedy thing. They started off, and they even started it off right. They started off with, the air being right, and the scary, and the clothes moving about him, and giving the idea that he was in flame, and that he was in hell, and everything, and it was perfect. And then all of a sudden, it just devolved into slapstick. And I was appalled. It to this day is actually, I do own the movie on DVD, but I leave the room when that part is on because it just offends me so deeply. Some honorable mentions of the best versions of Marley and just the best versions of A Christmas Carol, in my opinion, are the Muppets Christmas Carol, in addition to, of course, the George C. Scott ones, because that also captures very much of the book. There's actually probably more of the wording and dialogue of the book in the Muppets version than there is in any other version, because they put Gonzo as Dickens into the story, and so that allowed them to take some of the best lines of description and dialogue and have him say those in the film, which is something that almost never happens because it's almost always played straight. It's played as if we are in the scene with no narrator, and if there is a narrator, it's the very beginning and the very end, much like the George C. Scott version. Another version of Christmas Carol that I absolutely adore is The Stingiest Man in Town. Now, this is a musical version, and there are actually two versions out there of this. There's one that was originally made for television in the 50s with Basil Rathbone, and then there was a cartoon version, which more people will probably be familiar with, that was made by Rankin Bass in, I believe it was the 70s. The music from this is, in my opinion, is the best musical version of A Christmas Carol. The only one that even comes close is, again, the Muppets. And because, especially in the Marley scene, this song, I Wear a Chain, it actually, goes into the torture of what Marley is experiencing. It's a wonderful version of Christmas Carol, and if you've not seen it, even the cartoon, go ahead and try and track it down. It's available in certain holiday packs of DVDs that seem to turn up just about every year. It's worth your time, it's worth your money, it's worth buying the whole pack just for The Stingiest Man in Town, in my opinion. One other thing I wanted to talk about with Christmas Carol that is often left out, it's in the Jim Carrey version, it's in the George C. Scott version. There's a wonderful line where the Ghost of Christmas Present throws Scrooge's words back in his face. And to a significant extent, it's also in Stingiest Man in Town, in the one song, One Little Boy. And he asks the ghost, "Spirit, will Tiny Tim die?" The ghost replies, "I see an empty chair in the corner and a well-worn crutch carefully preserved. But if he is to die, then let him die, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge turns around and looks at the ghost, and he says, "You use my own words against me, Spirit." And the Spirit replies, "Yes, so that perhaps in the future you will hold your tongue, you will forbear that wicked cant, until you know who the surplus population is, and where it is. It may well be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." This, again, is maybe even more so than Marley, it's especially for Scrooge, is the significance of the story. This is what, one of the things that really turns Scrooge, because he's saying, now, not only am I throwing these people out and, taking their money in exorbitant fashions and all of that, but I'm causing a child to die in the long run, because Bob Cratchit was receiving so little money, he couldn't properly take care of Tim, he couldn't get him the surgeries or operations that he needed, and the nutrition, I would even say, that he was needing. And as a result, Tiny Tim did not survive in the original history. And yet this scene is almost always left out. This patch of dialogue is almost always left out of it because it's too scary for little kids, it's too impactful for the adults. And Dickens was not afraid to slap you in the face. Dickens was not afraid to say, "Listen up. This is what you're actually doing." phrase, the surplus population, is not original to Dickens. It was originally something that was being thrown about in Dickens' time. They would say that there was a surplus population. The people who were not contributing to society simply needed to be done away with, and quite literally done away with in some cases.
There is now a famous, or rather infamous, piece of audio from George Bernard Shaw, where he was describing very much the same sort of situation. He said, we will eventually need to have basically tribunals where we'll come together and we'll say to everybody every 3 or 4 years, "Sir or madam, would you please justify your existence to us?" If they're not giving back exactly what they take from society, or perhaps of giving back a little bit more, then we will no longer be able to use our facilities as a society for the purposes of keeping you alive. And then they would go on to execute them, was the original idea. This is actually one of the things that is believed to have been inspirational to the Nazis. So that is the end of those lines of thinking, the surplus population.
So by saying that, Dickens was retorting to them and saying, you don't understand what the surplus population is. If there is a surplus population, it's people like you who think this way. But of course, Dickens actually believed that every life was significant. Every life affected the world. And there's another story that I do plan to adapt. I actually have the script already written, and I'm hoping to have it out next year, that he wrote, called The Chimes. And it's kind of the reverse of The Christmas Carol. If you read the story of A Christmas Carol as a rich man finding out what will happen if he doesn't change his ways, The Chimes is a poor man finding out what happens if he believes the rich people that have told him that he's of no worth and no significance. There's also a great reading of that original book of The Chimes. I actually have 2 of them that I would recommend. One is by Geoffrey Palmer, and the other is by Richard Armitage, whom you will know from the Hobbit movies. He played Thorin Oakenshield. So, what part of the Christmas Carol is most significant to you? Is it parts I've mentioned, or is it something else? Please let us know in the comments section. Please tell us what you thought of this production, what you think of A Christmas Carol, and what books you might like to hear us read from in the future. As always, our productions are available on Bandcamp and on Patreon. If you'd like to visit us there and support us, we'd greatly appreciate it. Please check us out at facebook.com/Club40Audio and give us a like so you can follow us and find out all the interesting things we have coming up. For those of you who are listening to The Factory, our next episode will be due out hopefully at the end of January. I'm a one-person operation generally, so it only comes as I can do it at the moment, but I'm hoping to expand in the future. Please keep your ear to the ground for that. And I can tell you that our next story in The Factory will be a 1930s or 40s noir story. Of course, it goes stranger and deeper than that, but I don't want to give away too much too soon. In the coming year, we hope to present not only The Factory, but a couple of other series, not the least of which will hopefully be our Literary Corner. This is Wesley Critchfield for Club 40 Audio, wishing you and yours a very Merry Christmas. The preceding was a presentation of Club 40 Audio, with a reading of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and a short introduction from Stand Up Mr. Dickens, a Dickens anthology presented by Edward Bleschen and Jill Bennett. Your reader was Wesley Critchfield. All rights reserved.